The county surplus yard sat behind the road department shop on the east side of Fulton, Kansas, fenced in with sagging cattle panel and a gate that only opened on sale days. Inside the fence, old culvert pipe sections stood on end like rusted barrels. Bent guardrail was stacked against a concrete block wall. Road signs with bullet holes leaned in rows, and near the back, half buried in foxtail and ragweed, 12 steel bridge beams lay in 2 stacks of 6, brown with rust, caked with dried mud, bolts still threaded into some of the flaying holes. Marty Hobbs stood near the beams with a clipboard. He worked the county road department and managed the surplus sales twice a year. He had already sold a pile of old stop signs to a decorator from Lawrence and a tandem axle load of busted concrete to a rancher building a feed pad. The bridge beams had been sitting there since October, when the county pulled them out of an old crossing on Timber Creek Road and replaced the whole structure with precast slabs. Nobody had asked about the beams. Not once. Grace Whitaker walked the row slowly. She was 64, narrow through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket that had faded past whatever color it started as. Her boots were muddy from morning chores. Lena, her 28-year-old niece, followed 3 steps behind, arms crossed against the March wind. Ray Cullen was there too. He farmed 600 acres north of Grace along the same creek bottom. He leaned against his diesel pickup and watched Grace stop at the first stack of beams. He grinned at Marty. "She's not looking at those rusty things, is she?" Marty shrugged. "Price to move. 12 cents a pound. Scrap rate. County just wants them gone." Grace crouched next to the bottom beam. She ran a thumb along the lower flange where rust had built up in layers. She pressed hard. The rust flaked, but underneath, the steel was still gray and dense. She checked the web thickness, looked down the length of the beam for bowing, stood and moved to the next one. Pulled a tape measure from her jacket and checked the flange width on the third beam from the top. Lena stepped closer. "Grace, what are you doing?" Grace didn't answer right away. She moved to the second stack. 2 of the beams had bends near the bolt holes where they'd been pried out of the old bridge deck. She pushed those aside mentally. The other 10 looked straight. She checked one more flange, measured a second web. Then she straightened up and looked at Marty. "Load every one of them." Marty blinked. "All 12? All 12. Ray laughed out loud. "Grace, those came off that old Timber Creek bridge. County pulled them because they were done. You're buying somebody else's scrap pile." Grace pulled a folded check from her jacket pocket. "What do I owe, Marty?" Marty did the math on his clipboard. 12 beams, 124 by 26 wide flange, each about 22 feet long, roughly 312 pounds per beam at 26 pounds per foot. He multiplied it out and looked up. About $450 for the lot, plus your hauling. Grace wrote the check on the tailgate of her truck and handed it over without a word. Lena watched the whole thing and said nothing until they were back in the cab. Then she turned to Grace. $450 for rust, and now we need a flatbed to haul them. You want to tell me what those are for?" Grace started the truck. "Not yet." Grace started the truck. "You want to tell me what those are fifth?" By afternoon, the beams were a topic at the Fulton Co-op. Ray told the story while filling his sprayer tanks. A woman bought 12 rusted bridge beams the county threw away, paid cash, wanted every single one. The men at the counter shook their heads. One of them said she'd probably try to sell them to a scrapyard in Kansas City and lose money on the diesel. Another said she might be building a cattle guard. Ray said he didn't know what she was building, but those beams were junk and the county pulled them for a reason. Nobody asked Grace directly. People in that part of the county didn't pry into a neighbor's business unless it crossed a fence line, but they talked. Grace hired a flatbed from a trucking outfit in Leavenworth. The driver backed into the surplus yard, and Marty used the road department's old knuckle boom loader to set the beams on the trailer. Each one clanged down heavy enough to rock the truck on its springs. Rust dust rose in small brown clouds. Some of the bolt holes still had broken stubs of old carriage bolts frozen in place. One beam had a streak of original green paint visible under the rust, like a scar showing old skin. The driver hauled them to Grace's farm and unloaded them along the fence line behind her machine shed. 12 beams, laid out in the grass like the ribs of something enormous and forgotten. Lena stood at the shed door and stared at them. They looked like they belong in a salvage yard. Grace walked the row again just as she had at the surplus sale. She sorted them in her mind. 10 straight beams with solid webs, 2 with bends near the bolt holes. She'd use the 10. The bent 2 would go behind the shed as spares. "Come with me," Grace said. "I want to show you something." They drove the farm truck down a back lane that ran south from the barn, past the old hay meadow, through a wire gate, and along a tree line to the creek. The lane hadn't been used much in years. Grass grew between the tire tracks. A few hedge trees had started to lean into the path. The creek was called Little Walnut. It wasn't dramatic. Maybe 20 feet wide at normal flow, knee-deep in the middle, running over a gravel and limestone bed. But right here, at the back corner of Grace's property, there was an old crossing. You could see it if you knew where to look. Flat limestone ledge on both sides. Old gravel piled on the approaches, mostly washed thin. A few chunks of broken concrete from some past attempt at reinforcement. And on the far bank, the faint track of a lane that connected, eventually, through a neighbor's field easement, to a gravel road that ran east toward the state highway. Grace parked the truck and they walked down to the water's edge. She pointed at the south bank. The soil was cut back in a raw vertical face about 4 feet high where past floods had chewed into the ground. Grass hung over the lip. Roots dangled in the air. On the north bank, the old approach gravel had been scattered downstream. Fence posts along the tree line had mud stains on them at 2 different heights, one about waist level, one just above Grace's head. "Those marks are from 93 and 95, Grace said. 2 different floods, 2 different years. Lena looked at the cut bank, then upstream toward the county road. "The county bridge is less than a mile from here. Why does this crossing matter?" Grace pointed north. "Walk that road in your mind. You leave our place, go north on the lane, hit the county gravel road, turn east a quarter-mile to the bridge. The bridge sits up on concrete piers about 8 feet above normal water, looks solid, looks permanent." "It is solid. The bridge is. But what about the road on either side of it?" Lena didn't answer. "Last 50 yards before that bridge, on the south approach, the road drops down to about 3 feet above the creek. Gravel shoulder, no riprap, ditch on both sides. That section floods first. Water doesn't have to go over the bridge. It just has to go over the road next to it." Grace let that settle. "A bridge can stand all day and still leave you stranded if the road leading to it washes away." Lena looked at the old crossing, then back at the county road. "But the county maintains that road. They grade it every spring. They grade the surface, they don't armor the base. That shoulder is 3 feet of packed gravel sitting on clay. When water gets underneath, the clay turns to soap. The whole section slides into the ditch, and there's nothing holding it together." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the old fort again, at the scoured gravel and the exposed limestone ledge, and for the first time she didn't argue. Grace called Clay Barnes the next morning. Clay was 71, retired from 30 years of welding and equipment work. He'd helped the county set bridge beams back when they still used local contractors. He had an old case backhoe on a trailer and a portable welder that ran off a diesel generator. He lived alone on 40 acres east of town, and mostly spent his time fixing things other people had given up on. He drove out to Grace's place and looked at the beams lined up behind the shed. He walked the row the same way Grace had, checked the flanges, kicked a couple of webs with his boot heel and listened to the ring, pulled a pocket knife and scraped rust off one beam down to bare metal. Looked at it close. "Surface rust," he said. "Deep in some spots, but the section's still good on most of these. County pulled them early. Could have gotten another 15 years out of them on a farm crossing. They just didn't want the liability." "That's what I figured," Grace said. She drove him down to the creek. He stood on the old crossing for a long time, looking at the cut bank, the gravel bed, the limestone ledge, and the way the creek bent just upstream, pushing current against the south side. "You're not trying to build a bridge," he said. "No, you want to armor this crossing so the water can't peel it apart. That's right, he rubbed his jaw. It won't stop a flood, Grace. Water comes up high enough, it'll go right over this whole thing. I know. I'm not trying to stop water. I'm trying to give it less to steal. Then he looked at the creek again and nodded slowly. I can work with that. They started the next week. Clay brought his backhoe and a load of creek rock from a quarry pile south of town. Grace rented a skid loader for the week. Lena helped on the ground, setting stakes and running a string line. The plan was simple in concept and hard in labor. They set the strongest beams along both edges of the crossing, parallel to the creek flow, bedded into trenches Clay dug with the backhoe. The beams sat below the surface of the lane, flanges down, webs packed with gravel and rock. They weren't spanning anything. They were anchoring the edges of the crossing so floodwater couldn't undercut and peel the gravel away. 2 more beams went across the worst section of the cut bank on the south side, set into the soil at an angle, backed with heavy stone. The effect was like reinforcing the skeleton of the crossing itself. The bones were steel, the flesh was gravel and rock, and the creek still had room to flow. Clay welded steel plates over the bolt holes to keep debris from catching. He cut the 2 bent beams into shorter sections and used them as additional edge anchors on the downstream side where current pressure was highest. Grace packed gravel between every beam by hand, tamping it with a plate compactor borrowed from the rental yard. It took 6 days. When they finished, the crossing didn't look like much. You could drive over it and barely notice the steel underneath. The beams were buried, invisible, just brown edges of rusted flange showing through the gravel at the margins. Grace set 2 tall fence posts with reflectors on each side so she could find the crossing at night. Clay stood on the far bank and looked back. From here, it just looks like a gravel ford. Good, Grace said. That's all it needs to be. April came in warm and wet. The forecast for the 3rd week called for 3 to 4 inches of rain over 2 days with another system behind it. Creeks across the county were already running higher than normal from a wet March. Road ditches along the county gravel had been full for weeks. The low section of road near the county bridge south of Grace's place had standing water in both shoulders after every rain. Grace walked down to the county road twice that week. Each time she stood where the gravel dropped toward the bridge approach. The ditch was running. Water seeped across the road surface in a thin sheet. She could see where the east shoulder had started to soften, the gravel dark and loose, tire tracks sinking deeper than they should. She looked at the bridge itself, standing solid on its concrete piers. Then she looked at the 50 yards of low gravel road leading to it, soft shoulder, no rock. Enough for 10 days. She called the feed mill and moved up her next delivery by a week. The driver brought it that afternoon, 1,200 pounds of cattle cube stacked in the barn. She called the vet's office and told them she had a cow close to calving, maybe 10 days out, and if they needed to come, the back lane was the way in if the county road closed. The receptionist took the note without comment. The following Monday, Grace drove the county road one more time. The shoulder had slumped another inch. A fresh crack ran parallel to the road edge on the south approach, just a hairline, maybe 30 feet long. Nobody else would have noticed it. Grace noticed it. Ray Cullen saw the feed truck at Grace's place that evening. He mentioned it at the co-op the next morning. Grace is stacking feed like she's expecting a siege. The men at the counter laughed. Ray said the county road looked fine to him. He'd driven it that morning with his grain truck. Bridge was solid. Road was solid, no problems. The first rain arrived on a Tuesday night. It was moderate. An inch by morning. The creek rose about 18 inches. Water ran across Grace's low crossing, maybe 6 inches deep, for about 4 hours. By noon it had dropped. Grace drove down to check. The gravel was still packed. The beam edges held. Small stones that would normally have washed downstream were still in place, caught against the buried flanges. "That's what I wanted to see," she said to Lena. Lena noticed the gravel looked almost untouched and finally began to understand. The real rain started Thursday. It began steady in the morning, a straight gray pour without wind, the kind that doesn't stop. By Thursday evening, 2 inches had fallen. The creek was up over its normal banks in the low pasture. The county road ditches were running like small rivers. Water was pooling across the gravel road in 3 places between Grace's lane and the bridge. Lena drove into town Thursday afternoon for diesel. On the way back, she crossed the bridge approach and felt the truck tires pull to the right where the shoulder was soft. She didn't mention it at supper, but she thought about it. Friday morning, it was still raining. Grace checked the radio. Another 1.5 inches expected through Saturday, with a second cell behind it that could add another inch Sunday morning. She put on her rain gear and drove down to the county road. The bridge was still standing. She could see it through the rain, solid gray concrete and steel guardrail, but the south approach was underwater. Not deep, maybe 8 inches, but the gravel shoulder on the east side had started to slump into the ditch. The crack she'd noticed the week before had widened. You could fit 2 fingers into it now. A section of road edge hung over open air, where the ditch had eaten underneath. She did not try to cross. She drove home. Friday afternoon, Lena stood at the kitchen window watching the rain. "Creek's up over the hay meadow fence," she said. "I've never seen it that high in April." Grace looked out. The low pasture was a shallow lake, brown water moving slowly through the grass. "My father saw it like this twice, 68 and 77. Both times the county road went out. You think it'll go out this time? I think it already started." By Friday evening, the county had posted road closed signs on both ends of the Timber Creek Bridge Road, not because the bridge had failed, because the south approach had washed out. A section of road 12 feet wide and 30 feet long had collapsed into the ditch where the creek overflow had undermined the gravel base. The bridge stood above it all, untouched, useless. Saturday morning, the scope of it became clear. Ray Cullen found out when he tried to get a feed truck to his place. The driver called him from the barricade. Road closed, no estimate on repair. He had enough hay for 5 days, maybe 6 if he rationed. His cattle were spread across 3 pastures, and the creek was between him and 2 of them. South of the bridge, Dale Hicks couldn't get to his barn from the county road at all. A 36-inch culvert under his field entrance had plugged with debris Friday night, and the backed-up water had turned his gravel drive into a creek of its own. 18 inches of water ran across his lane for 100 yards. His truck sat in the barn, and he couldn't reach it. The Tillman place 3 miles east lost access when floodwater cut across a low spot in their gravel lane, where it dipped through a draw. The water wasn't deep, but it had scoured the gravel down to bare clay and left a 2-foot washout across the full width of the road. A truck couldn't cross without risking an axle. Marty Hobbs fielded calls at the county shop all Saturday morning. The road crew had 4 blocked access reports by noon, plus the main washout on the bridge approach. Marty told each caller the same thing. They'd get to it when the water dropped and the ground could hold equipment. They had 1 motor grader, 1 backhoe, and 3 men. They couldn't fix every access point at once. The bridge approach was first priority, then the culvert, then the private lanes. Could be Wednesday, could be later. Phone calls went back and forth between the farms. Ray called Grace Saturday afternoon. "You getting out?" "Don't need to," she said. "I've got feed. I've got hay. Vet knows the back way in." Ray was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, "Right, I forgot about your back lane." Grace's crossing went underwater Friday night. The creek rose over it by nearly 2 feet at the peak. She didn't go near it. She waited. Saturday afternoon, the rain slowed. By Sunday morning, it had stopped. The creek was still high, but dropping steadily, an inch an hour. Grace walked down to the crossing at noon. Water was still running over it, but only about 4 inches deep now, slow and muddy. She could see the reflector posts on both sides. The gravel surface was rough. Silt and small driftwood had piled against the upstream beam edges, but the edges held. The south bank where clay had set the angled beams was intact. The current had pushed against the steel and the stone and moved on without tearing anything loose. By Sunday evening, the water was off the crossing surface. Grace drove the farm truck across slowly, checking for soft spots. The gravel was scoured thin in 2 places, but the steel underneath kept the base from washing out completely. She drove across and back, solid enough. Not pretty, but solid. Monday morning she called the vet. Her cow was showing signs. The vet drove in through the back lane, crossed the old ford without trouble, and reached the barn by 8 o'clock. He commented that the crossing was rough but solid, better than some county roads he'd driven that morning. The calf came that afternoon. Healthy heifer, up and nursing within the hour. Tuesday, Grace had a mineral delivery come through the same route. The driver had to take the long way around through Williamsburg to reach the East Gravel Road, but once he hit the back lane, the crossing got him to her barn without trouble. He said 3 other deliveries that week had been canceled entirely because farms couldn't be reached. The county road stayed closed until Wednesday. Even then, Marty's crew only opened 1 lane with a temporary gravel fill. Full repair took another 2 weeks. The culvert at Dale Hicks's place wasn't cleared until the following Monday. The Tillman Lane didn't get graded until May. Ray came by Thursday. He didn't come to the front door. He walked around to the machine shed where Grace was stacking the leftover fence posts from the crossing project. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the 2 bent beams stored against the shed wall. "I heard the vet got through your back lane." "He did." "And a delivery truck Tuesday. Mineral, 1,600 pounds. Ray nodded slowly. "County road was closed 4 days. I had to haul feed around through Williamsburg, added 30 miles each way. Dale couldn't get to his barn at all until Saturday. Tillman still can't drive their lane without bottoming out." Grace set another fence post on the stack. Ray looked at the beams again. "Those the same ones from the surplus sale?" "Same ones." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked toward the south where the back lane disappeared past the hay meadow toward the tree line and the creek. Then he turned back. "I drove past that bridge yesterday. Bridge is fine. Road next to it is gone. 6-foot drop-off where the shoulder used to be." He paused. "I wouldn't have thought to look at the road instead of the bridge." Grace didn't say anything to that. She picked up another fence post and added it to the stack. Ray cleared his throat. "Think Clay would help me look at a crossing on my east side?" "You'd have to ask him." He nodded and left. Clay Barnes drove out that weekend to inspect the crossing. He walked the whole length of it, checking where silt had deposited, where gravel had scoured, where the beams had shifted, if at all. He crouched at the south bank and looked at the angled beams he'd set into the cut face. The stone behind them was still locked in place. The creek had pushed against the steel, and the steel had held, and the water had gone around and over without finding a soft edge to exploit. He stood up and looked at Grace, who was standing on the north bank with a rake, pulling driftwood off the upstream beam edges. "You didn't build a bridge," he said. "You kept the creek from taking the road." Grace dragged a tangle of branches off the gravel and tossed it downstream. "That was the part I needed." Clay watched her work for a minute. The beams didn't fight the water. They just held the ground together while the water passed. That's why it worked. You gave the creek a path and took away the weak spots it would have torn open. Grace nodded. That cut bank on the south side would have been 6 feet deeper without those angled beams, and the gravel would have been 100 yards downstream. You know, most people would have looked at that county bridge and figured they were fine. Most people look at the bridge. I look at what's next to it. He didn't argue with that. He walked back to his truck, pulled out a notepad, and started sketching something for Ray Cullen's East Crossing. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace reset the gravel where it had scarred. She borrowed the skid loader again and brought in another half-load of creek rock to pack against the beam edges. She marked the high water line on both reflector posts with a notch from her pocket knife just below the top of the post. She cleared the ditch along the back lane where silt had settled. She checked every beam anchor by hand, kicking the flanges, listening for the solid ring of steel still seated in stone. Lena helped without being asked. She didn't talk much while they worked. But one afternoon, while they were tamping gravel into a scoured spot near the south bank, she stopped and looked at the crossing the way Grace had looked at it that first day she'd brought her down here. "The county will fix that road eventually," Lena said. "They'll patch it and it'll look fine again. Until the next one, and this crossing will still be here." Grace tamped another section of gravel flat. "That's the idea." Lena was quiet for a while longer, then said, "Dale still hasn't gotten his culvert cleared, and the Tillmans are driving through their pasture to get around that washout. Everybody trusts the system until the system has 4 emergencies and 1 grader." Lena tamped the next section herself without being told where. The second week of May, another storm system showed up on the forecast, 3 inches possible over 2 days. The creeks were still carrying snowmelt from up north and the ground was already saturated. Tuesday morning, before the rain started, Lena pulled on her boots and told Grace she was going to check the back lane. Grace watched from the kitchen window as Lena drove the truck south toward the tree line, past the hay meadow, through the wire gate, and down toward the creek. She didn't check the county road first, she checked the crossing. When she came back 20 minutes later, she walked into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee. Crossing looks good, gravel's packed, beams are set, reflectors are clean. Grace nodded and opened the weather on the radio. Outside, behind the machine shed, the 2 bent bridge beams leaned against the wall where Grace had stored them in March. Rusted brown, chipped paint, old bolt holes still visible. They didn't look like much, they never had, but they were there in case she needed them. The same way everything Grace prepared was there. Not because disaster was certain. Because when it came, the road everyone trusted would fail in the place nobody watched, and the only thing between you and being stranded was the work you did before the water rose. Subscribe for more rural stories about forgotten farm wisdom that still works when it matters.